Be here now. Just be here now.
Welcome to the Road Home podcast with Ethan Nichtern. Join Ethan as he and his guests explore the Buddhist path as it relates to art, culture, activism, politics, Western psychology, and more. If you'd like to support Ethan's podcast, please visit BeHereNowNetwork.com/Ethan.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Road Home podcast. I'm Ethan Nichtern, and I'm here with somebody whose writing I've admired for a while, journalist, author, patchy mindfulness practitioner, as he says, Oliver Burkeman, who just wrote the new book. It's a really cool book that is a bestseller right now, 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. So, Oliver, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
I want to have a conversation about time, productivity, what time is. This is a really interesting book because it's sort of, I would say it's kind of a anti-productivity Bible in some weird way. But always like to start with the same dumb question, which is whenever somebody's on the podcast who's a meditator, just like to ask about your origin story with practicing meditation.
Yeah, I feel dishonest describing myself as a meditator necessarily from one day to the next, but patchiness of meditation practice is definitely what marks me out. How did I come to it? I think I was dimly aware of meditation from about sort of my late teens when I was driving myself crazy with anxiety over university work and being a sort of totally counterproductively perfectionistic nightmare person with regard to my work. We could maybe talk about that. But it was really only in the last 10, 12 years that I've sort of got back more closely into that stuff. Couple of 5-day retreats is the week-long retreats, I think, is the most I can claim. It's always been there in the background, I guess. That's not a very satisfying answer, but there you go.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's definitely somewhere infused in your view of the world, because when you're talking about, in your book, there's mentions of Zen practice, which I think, as we talk about time, I would say Zen is the Buddhist tradition that has kind of the most interesting things to say about the nature of time.
Right.
And just about the nature of the present moment. It definitely seems like a mindfulness perspective or present moment centered perspective on the world is kind of at the heart of your relationship to time management.
Totally. Yes. I mean, I think the preponderance of Zen specifically comes partly from the fact that the Zen teachers seem to have all the best quotes. So when you're writing a book, it's you're rarely going to get a sort of more condensed statement of the point you're trying to reach than some kind of observation from a Zen teacher. I think I feel like there are so many definitions that get given to that word mindfulness, but there is right at the heart of this book, I think, the question of the way that so much of our focus on how to use time well ends up instrumentalizing time in such a way that we are not fully present in the moments that we have, that are the only things we have, and that there's something sort of deeply counterproductive and ironic in the idea of becoming such a brilliant user of your time that you miss the actual moments of your life.
So speaking to that, let's talk about the title for a sec. I mean, it's an interesting title, 4,000 Weeks. So what is 4,000 Weeks?
4,000 weeks is roughly the average-ish human lifespan in the West, sort of expressed in weeks. It's not. If you live to be 80, you'll have had a few more. obviously nobody knows how many they're going to get, and plenty of people end up getting into the 5,000s. It's really chosen just to sort of drive home the basic fact of the finitude, the limitation. And it does, I have lots of interesting feedback about this. It is definitely arresting. I hope it's not so shocking that the last thing people want to do is read a book with it written on the cover, because that would be commercially against my interests. But I do think there's something very powerful about expressing it in weeks, just because a week is the kind of thing that seems to be gone in a blink of an eye. It's very easy not to value. And yet 4,000 is not a very large number of such things to take up a life. Yeah.
And there's something about that reframing, right? Part of this is that we have this really conceptual understanding of time. And I've thought about that a lot, that so many of humanity's problems right now are our inability to kind of like conceptualize, what numbers even mean. So reframing it, like another example I give is when you look at wealth inequality, sometimes people say millionaires and billionaires.
Right. Yes.
Which is like saying, bunny rabbits and elephants are the same kind of animal, it's 1,000 times. So there is something very powerful about recontextualizing somebody's concept into a different frame that makes it feel much more, I guess, urgent is what 4,000 weeks makes our lifespan seem.
Right. I suppose one way of thinking about that is, it's very easy to get your head around an hour, but then you just assume that they are so numerous in an average life that they're effectively infinite. It's pretty difficult in a way to get your head around a year, but we all know we only get a few of those. And there's a kind of interesting midpoint in choosing something that you can get your head around, but that you clearly don't have an unlimited number of. And I think that's where weeks is quite a powerful framing. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, in a sense, this book is kind of coming out of, you have had a column, I think it's over now, in The Guardian for a long time called "This Column Will Change Your Life," which I know you meant very straightforwardly as a very arrogant statement. You're not
absolutely. Yeah. No, totally. Yeah.
But you look at a lot of sort of just being a modern person in the world and how to kind of contextualize your understanding of life and productivity and what meaningful happiness is, right? So it seems like would you say that that's kind of, is this book about happiness and how our relationship to time makes us unhappy? Is happy the wrong word?
I mean, on some level, I think I've published 3 books. One was a collection of columns. I've written from the start 2 books, and I think both of them are just really, another title for them could be here's my best understanding of how to think about life. One was more about happiness and the perils of positive thinking, and then this is much more about framed as time. But actually, part of the point I'm concerned to make is that time management, if you really think what that phrase entails, is almost a synonym for the question of how to live. It's only various strange phenomena of publishing and of capitalism, I suppose, that have led to this idea that time management is just about how to organize the projects in your job, or why you should cook all your main meals in a big batch on Sundays so you save time during the week or something. Sure, that's important, I suppose, but it's really like what isn't time management, I suppose, when you think about it like that.
Right. So it's interesting because as I was reading this, I'm writing a piece of fiction right now about a high school teacher who's also a Zen teacher, and it gives a Dharma talk about the nature of time, and it talks about time 3 different ways. But I want to get your take. Like, you quote Heidegger, you do quote the Zen tradition, and they're like, what is time? Just a small question.
Putting me on the spot. I think that I'm obviously not going to answer this completely directly, but hopefully not too indirectly. I think the main thing to say is that time, and maybe this is a parallel to happiness, it's just a really, really weird thing that gets weirder the more you think about it. I don't know. I forget who the quotation is from. It might be Augustine, but I might be embarrassing myself about how everyone knows what time is until you ask what time is, and then then you can't say what it is. It isn't, I think, in fact, many of our problems come from the idea that we think of it as a resource, as a thing that is separate from us, that we get to use or that we are in somehow, or that we possess. And it isn't quite any of those things. So I think that's why all these problems arise, because we're taking an attitude and an approach, and then we're attempting to control something that isn't the thing that we think it is. So I guess what I'm doing here is sort of creating a diagram of all the things that time is not, in order to get away with answering your question in a sneaky fashion. But I mean, I just think there's the stuff on Heidegger, which was which was certainly a challenge to try to come to grips with myself, let alone then turn into something sort of consumable in book form, in my book form, leads to this notion that time is in fact so completely definitional of who we are that it kind of is synonymous in a sense with being, with human existence, that we just are a portion of time. And that if you can sort of get inside that thought, and maybe we can talk more about that, there's something very powerful about that notion that we are time. And I don't think it's one that, a physicist would accept, but we're not talking in that vein now, I suppose. And that then makes a lot clearer why these attempts to master or dominate, control, or get a handle on time are sort of doomed to fail from the outset, because they are trying to do something that just doesn't make sense. It's a category error in the context that we're talking about.
And in a sense, I mean, I think you could also say that right, when you're talking about 4,000 weeks, you're talking about, like, when we say time, we mean a very linear kind of commodified approach to time, right? And maybe that's the relationship with capitalism, although I imagine democratic socialism, would still have some kind of commodified, you'd have to demonstrate labor equals, it's in any economic system that, like, has to be some portion of labor or work energy that is related to how much time you spend doing it, right? So 4,000 weeks is really about this kind of depleted sense of running out of linear time, right? Mm-hmm. So it's interesting because the Heidegger quote, it's pretty almost spot on. I wonder if this is where the translators actually got it from. Zen Master Dogen and other Zen teachers talking about being time. Like, right. Sometimes it's translated, being hyphen time. So, like, this more spontaneous relationship to being in time.
Yeah, right. And I guess what a lot of this comes down to is how you hold that linear notion, whether you see it as a kind of a useful organizing tool. We had to have some sense of that linear structure in order to make the appointment to talk today, and it wouldn't have worked if we hadn't. Versus the idea that is some kind of way of taming time, of sort of imposing your sort of ego onto time in a way that then just generates all sorts of stress and anxiety. It's not that timetables and schedules and plans can be dispensed with entirely, but they can be seen for what they are and for all that they are. One of the, maybe this takes us off what you want to talk about, but one of the quotes that does come from a very directly American Buddhist source in the book is that line from Joseph Goldstein about that what we forget when it comes to planning is that a plan is just a thought, a present moment statement of intentions, not a kind of way of grasping the future and making it submit to our intentions for it. And that really gets to me at this distinction between whether we're sort of understanding that we are in the present moment only, or that we are the present moment only, and it's fine to have all these symbolic representations of linear time to manage and organize our collective lives together, versus the idea that we're somehow we're somehow outside of time, and we're going to somehow bring this yardstick or this this sort of linear notion of time under our control. I don't know if that even made the slightest bit of sense.
It does. I mean, what I found from reading the book is there's this real kind of back and forth between, well, storytelling and quotes from history, and then kind of the practical level of sort of questioning what our relationship to time means for our productivity or time management, et cetera. And then the philosophical level of like, what is, the existential questions of like, what is time? What is humanity? So if we got into the more like practical level, like what is good about wanting to be a productive human? Like there has to be some good thing there about like wanting to get like you talked about like wanting to clear out the inbox of your email. Like there has to be something good about having good methods of like clearing out your inbox. No?
Yeah, absolutely. No, totally. I think it's using the sort of generic label of efficiency for these things, that there's probably a discussion to be had there too, but it's like, it's great to become more efficient at doing things that you want to do. The issue is that efficiency, or productivity for that matter, pursued in the absence of any other value, is just a celebration of like getting any tasks done. Mm-hmm. The idea that getting to the end of the day and you've done a lot of things is there's something virtuous in that. I think that's a problem that we're sort of, that's greatly reinforced by the culture in which we live. So my railing against efficiency and productivity in the book is not really a railing against streamlining the ways that you work in order to do more of the things that you care about, but is about what happens when efficiency is the only goal, and how that then distorts the systems that it's a feature of, and actually just generates more and more less and less meaningful work, because the default thing that will happen to any system that you make more efficient in the absence of any other guiding values is that you'll just attract more inputs and less there'll be less discernment among the inputs. So you'll just get you get really good at handling your email. If all you're doing is focusing on that, all that happens is you just get a ton more email as a result. And
right.
So you don't actually get to the end of this process that you were hoping to get to the end of.
Yeah. And there is also, I've noticed that there's a kind of fine line between making yourself very available, to the interpersonal level of this, to constantly being like able, I want to be that person who responds to emails in like 10 minutes. And I've noticed that sometimes it's actually helpful to create a buffer that slows down, but both just, being a person who, wants to do a lot, and who a lot of people want, or a fair number of people want stuff from that sometimes it's nice to actually just slow down the process and say, don't be the person who gets back to everybody on the same day. I'm
fascinated. Yeah. I'm fascinated by that how that unfolds in your life, because if you just say yes to incoming demands, then firstly, your activities will be structured entirely by other people's priorities, which in the context of being a teacher or something is not all bad. Part of what you're there to do is to incorporate other people's priorities, but in a very sort of distorted way, right? Because if that's all you do, then all that happens, and if you just, for example, and the same would be true of sort of running your work out of your inbox, just reactively responding to everything that comes in. Firstly, other people are setting the agenda. Secondly, other people are setting the agenda in contexts where like the cost to them of sending the email or making the query is nothing, and the cost to you of fulfilling it might be much more serious. You might end up just sort of serving the pushiest people in your world instead of the most deserving. So there's all sorts of ways in which, if you're just trying to be as efficient as possible at dealing with life's inputs, things will go wrong and get distorted. Yeah.
Yes. And then that also empowers the pushiest people to have the most power in the world, which is, you can know a good explanation of, the last 6 years of American life. Like the more sociopathically narcissistic you are, the more power you get. That's probably not a good system for time management as a society. It's interesting to actually take that. I mean, as a teacher, it is interesting because you do have to, especially when you're actually trying to help people and you're one of the people you're trying to help. That's another thing about the Buddhist teachings is sometimes people say like compassion or being like a bodhisattva is about helping others, which I think everybody kind of wants to do. I think it's a very small percentage of the human race that would say, I'm trying to do all this stuff and be super productive just for me, right? Even people who are very maybe driven by power, they might say something like, I'm trying to make my family safe, So like we're all trying to help others, but there's a kind of question of like, what is actually helpful, and is it actually helpful to be the person who's always speeding up other people's, the interdependence of this, then the other person's inbox is fuller and fuller too. And they're moving at a faster pace, et cetera. I mean, it seems like what you're talking about with the finitude of life, which I think we could also talk about the difference between a time on a multiple lifetime scale versus like a scientific materialistic scale in which this finitude makes quite a lot of sense to just say we do have these 4,000, look what I did, 4,000 weeks. It seems like the finitude, there's a quality of, there's never enough, right? You could literally, if you take that approach of productivity, you can never do enough until the whole thing collapses, either into personal stress and breakdown or social collapse, right?
Right, absolutely. It's a problem of limits that I think is absolutely paralleled in various sort of environmental and economic contexts. There's no, I'd love to talk about how multiple lifetimes impacts this because it blows my mind and I don't know exactly how you understand multiple lifetimes. But here we are, at least in the standard Western understanding, with the capacity to make infinite plans, to have infinite numbers of ambitions, to feel infinite amounts of obligation about what we ought to be doing. Being conscious gives us this capacity for sort of unlimited imagination, and then we're these material beings who have a limited amount of time and a limited amount of stamina and limited resources of all sorts of other kinds. So there's sort of a built-in mismatch. And I think the sort of underlying psychological theory that I'm trying to explore in the book is that an awful lot of what we do with regard to time that goes wrong is because we're engaged not in trying to make the most meaningful use of time, but in trying to avoid the discomfort, the emotional discomfort of acknowledging this mismatch, acknowledging that reality is kind of stubborn and constraining and claustrophobic, and that we have to sort of be these sort of, you might say, infinite souls in a finite, limited material universe. And that means tough choices, and it means sacrifices, and it means that every time you decide to spend a day or a lifetime doing one thing, you're deciding not to spend it on something else or a million other things. So I think it's that mismatch, I guess, that I'm really trying to explore. Yeah. And then if in that context, you jump onto some great new approach to productivity or efficiency with the idea that that's going to get you out of this situation, that it's going to be the back door to, then you're effectively pursuing a kind of immortality through your quest for efficiency. And I think, what happens then is eventually you burn out, or eventually you, as a society, deplete the environment that is giving you sustenance and making the whole thing possible in the first place.
So I just think there's something really disappointing in accepting limitation, right? I imagine somebody with great aspirations, or maybe, I don't know, maybe they would love to read. I don't know. But I imagine a tech CEO, for example, reading your book, which I'm sure actually, because it's, it's a best-selling book, and I'm sure it's actually making rounds in those circles. I actually, one of my best friends who works in media, I told him, we were hanging out Sunday and told him about upcoming podcasts, and he was like, I'm reading that book right now, talking about 4,000 Weeks, and he pulled out his iPhone and he was reading it.
Excellent. On
the very device that you critique a lot in the book as well, the smartphone. So I imagine this is making the rounds, but do you imagine like somebody who's trying to start like, or in the midst of a huge enterprise to achieve, to go, to build, to, with that endless capitalist idea of building, reading this, and do you imagine them feeling disappointed or relieved or agreeing with it, but not applying any of these principles to their notion of time?
It's an interesting question. I mean, my sense so far, obviously it's totally self-selecting, because I only hear from the ones of that kind of person who has benefited and is happy that they read it, instead of the ones who sort of...
You never hear from people who are unhappy with you?
Well,
I need to learn how to do that.
No, I do hear people unhappy with that. I just mean that you don't tend to sort of, if you dismiss a book as worthless, you're probably not going to email the author to tell him he wrote a worthless book. Whereas
right.
if you really loved it, you might well get in touch. So at this stage, anyway, there's something self-selecting. I think that, well, firstly, I think that I was quite deliberately in the book trying to be fairly agnostic about what your goal in life is, right? I may happen to think that that certain kinds of work and certain kinds of commitment to important causes is a better goal in life than owning as many Lamborghinis as you can possibly acquire. But I still think most of these dynamics apply in either case, right? That even if your goal is something that I might be quite snooty about and say was not the path to a meaningful life, it's still the case that refusing to make tough choices about how you use your time, attempting to constantly get on top of absolutely everything instead of understanding the real nature of your limitation, that's still going to help you acquire the fleet of sports cars, right? I think even if that's your goal. So there is that to say. I don't think that there's necessarily an intrinsically progressive or ethical or anything like, or moral kind of point to be made about time. But the other point, I guess, is just that, my hope about the reaction that sort of person would have is that the kind of disappointment that we're talking about here is a sort of bracing and almost energizing disappointment. This feels like a slightly Pema Chodronish thought, I think, to talk about disappointment and disillusion in this way, but comes up in other traditions and other writers as well. But this idea that it's letting those, it's sort of dropping back down to the ground of how things really are. That's exactly where you are, again, in contact with the ground and can put one foot in front of the other, because you're no longer floating in this kind of escapist, avoidant, imaginary world of limitlessness. I think, as an aside, this is why digital distraction is such an important topic, because the phenomenology of being online is that it does feel limitless. It does feel like you can be the sort of little god of your time instead of coming back down to earth with a bump. So I think that when people get what I hope I'm saying, it's that it is a defeat, it is a surrender, and it is a kind of disappointment. But that's the kind of defeat or disappointment that is the prelude to something something very engaged and proactive.
Yeah, and that still allows you to have a kind of vision of some kind of accomplishment. I mean, I know like writing a book is a multi-year process. You can't do that without having some sense of like aspiration, intention, plan, like action.
No, absolutely. No, totally. Of course. Yes. And you can absolutely have aspirations in that context. In fact, I think it's the precondition for realizing some of those aspirations is to drop this kind of impossible, or at least somewhat let go of this kind of impossible scramble for a kind of omnipotent stance with respect to time.
Yeah. So I do feel like we could have like a more philosophical conversation about like time and the vision of multi-lifetimes if you wanted to. I mean, if you're into, you're a person who wrote a book and quoted Heidegger and Kafka. Well, you told stories about Kafka and Zen teachers and Joseph Goldstein. But I think let's talk a little bit about digital distraction first.
Sure, I'll be guided. I'll be guided by you. It's absolutely fine. We can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, so you take your book for a period of time into like arenas that very similar to watching the movie on Netflix, The Social Dilemma, and just about kind of your attention being sold, and that's obviously not all that social media or, your device or digital distraction does, right? It wouldn't just work if we were just like selling ourselves up to eyeball slavery. It does provide community and connection on the positive side, right? So that's the tricky thing. Like even a lot of my, moral friends who are highly ethical people, like I got off Facebook, a few years ago because of just the devastatingly, I wouldn't even say immoral. I just think Mark Zuckerberg, if you hear him talk, it's like he has no moral compass at all, either good or bad. It's like he just does not think through the implications of his actions, to the point where I read a Vice article that they're starting to talk about the next wave of this all being the multiverse using the Oculus and VR. And he's having the people working on this read the novel Ready Player One, which has a totally dystopian version of Earth where people escape into virtual reality to basically be able to survive how awful planet Earth has become. And he's reading that as sort of like, this is what we're going to do.
Yes. Sorry.
But also, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, like these do allow you to like connect with ideas. Like I feel like I go on Twitter to hear different people's ideas and to not just have the New York Times or Washington Post like tell me what I'm supposed to be caring about,
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the downsides are synonymous with the upsides. Really, they are. You're being shown and connected to things that you want to be connected to in some sense. I think that what you're isolating here is that there are two senses of wanting to be connected to things on social media or to be shown certain things on social media. One is this very sort of impulsive, the appeal of gossip and fights and things. And then the other is sort of higher values like community and finding out about things. And yeah, I'm absolutely not I have not renounced all social media at all. And I think that is partly because I'm full prey to its addictive qualities, but I don't think it only is. No, I mean, I think where I talk about digital distraction in the book, it's really a question of understanding the role that it's filling in our reality avoiding mechanisms. That doesn't follow that nothing good can happen on there at all. No.
Right. But it does create this situation where, as we said, with boundaries, you can't really boundary your experience if the place you go for your distraction and the place you go for the presence are the same device,
Right. Yes. So you need, I mean, it's something of a losing battle that I think you sort of have to fight anyway, is to kind of impose boundaries of time, boundaries based on devices. I won't say I never, but I almost never have Twitter installed on my smartphone because that's a recipe for disaster for me. Having it on a desktop is, relatively speaking, a saner way to interact with it. And then then at least if I can physically get my body up from my desk, I'm at least not going to be on social media then, so it's and I have all sorts of aspirations that are never quite realized, for staking out specific points in the day to go on and respond to people who responded to me and sort of be in the social media space for a 30-minute period and then stop and get up. None of it is ever perfect, because as to quote Tristan Harris, there's always 1,000 people on the other side of the screen at any one moment who are paid to try to keep you there. So I'm not going to win that battle, but I think it's a useful one to participate in all the same, to sort of push back. It's probably easier, and certainly in my experience, it has been easier to renounce it entirely. If you can weather the first week of being a sort of hermit from social media, the subsequent weeks are actually quite straightforward. But I don't know. It's not where I'm at the moment. And promoting a book, it certainly feels as though it's been very helpful to be there. But I guess it's designed to feel like that. So.
But you're going into it with a specific intentionality and purpose that also can maybe serve, at least in the short term, as a boundary, right? As a way to approach this.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, maybe this is getting a bit too grandiose or arrogant, but I hope that some of the message that I'm promoting through it is at least slightly undermining of the worst excesses of it. So I hope I'm a relatively good citizen of social media in that respect. I mean, it's a little bit the same writing an email newsletter where half the subject matter is to do with not being overwhelmed by tasks and to-dos and emails in the modern world. I'm engaged in some form of contradiction there, but you can hope that your own email brings a little bit of calm in the middle of that day, I think.
Yeah. But it is interesting to just have that awareness that, like, the people on the other side of that screen, even if you know multiple people who work at social media companies, which I do, like, they're not your friend in that moment.
Right.
Like,
I think this, this basic thing that people do, I think, understand more and more, but that it's easy to lose sight of. If you're not paying for the product, you are the product. That the business model of social media is to sell your attention to advertisers. It is not it is not primarily that people are paying to bring their interesting things to your eyeballs. I think that's very useful to keep in mind.
Yeah. And it seems like in that there is a critique in this about limitless productivity when you relate it to time. I mean, we don't have to get into Marxism, et cetera. And I find, having studied economics, that very few people who use the terms capitalism or socialism actually know what those terms historically mean in political economy and stuff like that. But there is a relationship between profit, meaning limitless profit, which I would say is a different thing from wealth, like pushing everybody towards this, and that's also an interesting thing. Like, even in some of the critiques of the mindfulness movement, or huge corporations taking on mindfulness, like Google's Search Inside Yourself program, there were some interesting critiques. It's like, is this just to help Google employees be able to work longer days and kind of survive the stress of productivity being placed on them? Is it,
sorry. Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead. There's an interruption. Sorry, there's a delay on the line. I think.
Go ahead, please.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think this all sort of collects into this one big question of it's to do with instrumentalization, right? It's to do with using time, using meditation, using the different ways we could be present in the moment, primarily for some future goal. And in the classic case, that future goal is corporate profit. But there's something wrong with placing all your value in the future, even if your goal is something more wholesome than corporate profit. It's still all to do with living in the future instead of experiencing the moment.
Especially if you don't even have a vision of that future other than, like, we'll just move to Mars after we ruin planet Earth. Like, that's not a really good vision for a future. But that is literally the vision by one of the most so-called forward-thinking humans who exist now, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos too. They're saying, like, we'll just ruin the planet and go somewhere else, right? And it's a productivity scam.
Yeah, no, and I mean, really, I think what that means is not that we're then going to live peaceful lives on and peaceful or humble lives on Mars, right? It's just a question of it really is just a question of seeing that on the other side of what we thought was the limit, there is actually another unlimited. So it's the pursuit of ongoing limitlessness that is is the sort of psychological underlying drive there, I assume.
Yeah. So yeah, this might be a good place to talk about finitude versus continuity, which is the way I would think about the sort of concept of like what happens after the 4,000 weeks,
right.
Which I think, this is really interesting because these are all philosophical discussions. Since Buddhism had like, a 2,500 year history, it was, none of these ideas are really new when you get into it. Like the basic structure. Even the 18th, 19th century, European white male thinkers are, having conversations that were had in another form,
absolutely,
in lots of different places. And I think historically we learn mostly about like, places like Greece. And then we're now learning about like the ancient conversations in places like Asia. We still don't have enough of sort of the ancient conversations about these matters from the global South, but hopefully that's developing now. But, what I know the most about is the development of Buddhist philosophy and a lot of the critiques, the Buddhist philosophers over the years critiquing other worldviews. And, so Buddhism is interesting about limitations because it's both like really about acknowledging impermanence, exactly as you're talking about. Like, death is real. It comes without warning. This body will be a corpse. That's a daily contemplation in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. This body will be a corpse, and at the same time, there's a critique of a materialistic worldview, which, the classic view of materialism in India is the idea that basically all reality is just material, right? Mm-hmm. So things come, this idea that we are conscious being is really just a kind of accident of matter coming together in the right evolutionary pattern. And it comes from nothing. It lasts for about 4,000 weeks. And then it goes back to
returns to nothing,
dead matter. And so that's, I think classically that's framed more with like almost like a hedonistic or Epicurean worldview of like, just life is short. The only thing we know is like peak experience is the point, actually in her series, people make fun of me for this, but Gwyneth Paltrow's series on Goop on Netflix, which I thought there was a lot of interesting stuff in there, but she really frames the classic materialistic worldview. Like in the beginning, she said, like, we only have one life. Life is short, have the most fulfilling experiences you can, and I'm like, that's classic materialism,
Yeah.
At the same time, there were a lot of interesting methodologies in the series that my friends make fun of me for actually watching the whole thing through, but I did, and I enjoyed it. But it was interesting to just have that view of the philosophy, right? So
yeah.
Is there, how does this change if we actually are thinking beyond 4,000 weeks in some way? Not that you'll be in this body, but that there is a future beyond that we have to attend to in some way.
This is I find this such a sort of stimulating topic, and I also feel completely adrift in it. I feel like,
well, this is a podcast. We're supposed to feel adrift.
Good, excellent. Just to get this book written, I think, I absolutely had to draw a box around what I was focusing on and what I wasn't focusing on, because there's enough inside the box. It's pretty much the whole of earthly life in a sense. So yeah, I do pretty much just implicitly assume that the end of that life is the end of everything. There was a very interesting engagement with the book, a review from a Christian viewpoint that I read a little while ago, that sort of heaped praise upon the book and said that, if the writer wasn't Christian, he would probably just think it was the perfect guide to meaningful life as it was. We're not mere mortals, and therefore any book that is subtitled Time Management for Mortals and assumes that we are simply mortals has got to be incomplete. And it was a very sort of gracious way of both complimenting and completely undermining what I'm saying. And obviously that is a different perspective. That's a theistic perspective that says, actually the real reason that we shouldn't attempt to be the gods of our own time is that job is already taken, and that maybe the universe doesn't care what you do, or as I sort of suggest at various points in this book, but that God does. I just don't know enough, and maybe you can tell me about the Buddhist, or your Buddhist understanding of multiple lives, to understand what this would entail for this perspective. I mean, at the most basic level, I do think that there's clearly reality goes on beyond our own deaths. Clearly, future generations and non-human beings, and like these are all legitimate focuses of consideration when you're asking a question about how it is meaningful to spend your time. So there is a continuity in that sense, even if it is just, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and that's it. Well, those ashes and dust are part of a larger system in which we're all implicated. So I don't know what the role of sort of personhood in these ideas of multiple lives are, or whether it is a sort of poetic way of talking about the sort of ultimate interdependence of everything and everybody. But yeah, there's clearly a way that you could interpret a sort of hyper-secular understanding of 4,000 weeks and of finitude as like nothing mattering beyond the day that you die. And I'm sure we'd both want to disagree with that as a way of understanding meaning.
Well, it doesn't even have to be a question of one's own personal, future lifetimes or past lifetimes, which is not, I mean, any theory we could make about that would be unscientific as well,
Right.
And that's actually would be part of the modern Buddhist critique. I've heard Robert Thurman and others make this, that scientific materialism, the idea that consciousness is all physical, is a completely unscientific statement, because it's making a premise that cannot be tested in an experiment,
Right.
And it's actually taking the less likely of the two possibilities being something continues that we don't quite understand versus everything ends. And then you look at a universe where things do continue, seeds become trees, become fruits, become seeds. Like there is a clear continuation, and it's saying the less likely of the two possibilities for an experiment that you can't do is definitely true. So that would be,
I see that.
So that view of scientific materialism kind of disobeys its own premise. That's the idea.
And that's an argument for kind of idealism, which may be similar or related to mind-only Buddhism, which I don't pretend to understand. But there's a way of, or panpsychism in some forms, which is now newly respectable in academic circles. Right, the idea that the answer to all of this is that consciousness is primary and everything else is somehow a function of or within that, it seems quite like a pleasing way of thinking about it. I don't know what that means for, or would mean for, the themes of my book. But anyway, right. I don't know. It's also probably not what you're talking about.
No. It's just the main thing I'm thinking about is like sort of looking at time, trying to find some way to live in time that's very urgent and very much present, the way you're describing, with this kind of call to like actually embracing life as it is, and knowing what life is and what the limitations of that are, and all the ways we want to deviate from our limitations that make us unhappier, right? And at the same time, looking at the scope of our influence within those 4,000 weeks as having a broader impact, especially going forward, because
right.
It does seem like the world's getting very nihilistic, in this sense of like, for example, I never hear powerful people such as those tech billionaires or any Republican elected official in the United States, never hear them talk about the future. Never hear them talk about what they think the world looks like 50 years from now and why it's going to be a good place.
Right.
It's very it seems like the cycle of productivity just kind of drives us into the ground, to this place of collapse. And is there a way to look at long-term sustainability, both of being a being and society, at the same time as we're kind of embracing our strong limitations, in a way that you're talking about in this book?
I mean, yeah, it's a really good point, isn't it? What those billionaires are doing is making personal preparations for when the future turns out to be very bad, but they're not talking about what the future could be, collectively speaking. I think those two things are, in fact, that you mentioned at the end there, are in fact completely consistent. At the end of the book, I write about this outlook that I sort of slightly frivolously call cosmic insignificance therapy, and the great relief of understanding that the importance of what you do and the decisions that you make are really, in the scheme of things, incredibly tiny, and what a sort of liberation that can be. And one of the conversational pushbacks that one obviously gets is, well, it really matters what we do now in terms of the fate of the environment, most obviously. Perhaps it doesn't matter very much as on the individual level, but it certainly collectively it matters to the future in a very sort of decisive fashion. I think what I want to say about that really is just that the way that these things combine, the idea of a focus on the future with an understanding of your own limitations, is precisely in not making it the standard for your own meaningful contribution to humanity's time, that you are able to save the planet, that you are able to bring about the end of income inequality, et cetera, that actually understanding how tiny each of us is almost like it's the first step in then being able to make the contribution that we can make, a sort of right-sized understanding of our own contribution, rather than being sort of paralyzed by this notion that everything's terrible, and unless we can figure out a way to have an impact that a human on their own or even in community cannot have, then there's no point in doing anything. So I think it's sort of anti-nihilistic in that sense. And I'm always struck by, there's a certain kind of, I don't know how familiar you are with like Wendell Berry's work and things like that, but there's a certain aspect of that which says, if you're concerned about landfills and pollution, by all means join an organization, but also like pick up the trash on your street. And this is a question I feel like that comes up in Buddhist circles a lot, this notion that whether these small and local changes, the things that you really can do right now after listening to this podcast, whether it's sort of a poetic or symbolic thing to suggest that they are absolutely essential to the whole, whether it's a purely mathematical thing that, if everyone does it, then maybe we can make a difference, or whether there's something stranger and deeper going on. Charles Eisenstein writes about this a lot, the environmentalist economist, that there may be some way beyond our understanding that kind of embodying certain values is more important than the degree to which you can sort of quantify the impact of that on your street or on your neighborhood. And then this gets us into that strange topic of whether doing lots of formal meditation on the cushion is the best thing you can do for the environment, because somehow it makes humanity a better thing. I don't know where I stand on any of that.
Well, I think that notion of limitations bringing us back to our individual contribution, I think that feels like an incredibly optimistic, limited, but realistic and optimistic place to end, which feels like the right message for the book that you wrote, which is a great book.
Thank you. No, I really hope it is kind of optimistic. I keep coming back to these words like bracing, or in terms of what I would like it to be. It's the acceptance of something unpleasant that has the effect of providing energy and focus to do things that feel like the right things to be doing.
So, so the book again is 4,000 Weeks. Time Management for Mortals. And you can follow Oliver also on Twitter, where he's at Oliver, and Burkeman is spelled Burkeman. And it's a good read. It's not just a sort of like, here's how to do things, but it's a really good balance of storytelling and philosophy. It's published by FSG Books. Nice to share a publisher with you.
Yeah.
And I would love to have you back on the podcast sometime to talk about more far out and very practical topics at the same time.
I'd love it. And I'd love to understand multiple lives and reincarnation. So we must do that.
We all would. Well, anyway, thank you, Oliver Burkeman. And for the Road Home podcast, this is Ethan Nichtern, and we'll see you all next time.